My sister stood up at our aunt's memorial reception. In front of 40, some relatives holding paper plates of deviled eggs and pimento cheese sandwiches, and told them I'd looted the house before the lawyer even arrived. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull me into a hallway. She set down her sweet tea on my aunt's good tablecloth, the one with the tatted lace edge that had survived 3 moves and 1 house fire, and she said, loud enough to stop every conversation in that parlor at once, "I think we all need to ask Margaret what happened to Aunt Jo's brooch." I was holding a cup of coffee I hadn't drunk yet. I remember that detail more clearly than almost anything else from that afternoon, the exact weight of the cup in my hand, the little tremor of heat still coming off it, because I'd been too busy greeting people to actually drink any of it. "I'm sorry," I said. "The sapphire brooch, Grandmother Calder's brooch, and the Audubon prints from the front hall. And there was cash in that safe, Margaret. I know there was, because I saw it 2 years ago when Aunt Jo showed me." Vivian's voice was doing the thing it does when she wants an audience to feel the size of her hurt before they've had a chance to ask a single clarifying question. "You were alone in this house for over an hour before anyone else got here. Alone. With the safe unlocked. I want you to sit with that accusation for a second. The way I had to sit with it, standing in the middle of a room full of people who had known me my entire life. Because I think it's the moment that decides everything else in this story. 3 things were true in that parlor that I didn't yet understand. I didn't understand why Vivian had brought up the safe specifically, when nobody else in that room had mentioned the safe at all. I didn't understand why our mother, standing 4 feet away from me in her good black dress, didn't immediately say something in my defense, didn't even look at me, actually, just looked down at her own hands like she was doing math with them. And I didn't understand, not yet, not for weeks, that the woman making this accusation already knew, better than anyone else standing in that room, exactly where every one of those missing items had actually gone. My name is Margaret Calder. Everyone who's known me more than 5 minutes calls me Maggie. I'm 59 years old, I live in Savannah, Georgia, and for 26 years I've run a company called Calder Provenance, document authentication, estate archives, rare paper appraisal. Museums call me when they need to know if a letter is real. Insurance companies call me when a family swears a diary is worth 6 figures and needs someone honest enough to tell them it isn't. I built that business from a card table in the back room of my aunt's antique shop, and by the time my Aunt Josephine Calder died on a Tuesday morning in March, I had a reputation good enough that people flew documents to me from 3 states away rather than trust anyone closer to home. I'm telling you all of that first because I need you to understand exactly who was standing in that parlor holding a cold cup of coffee when my own sister decided, in front of our entire family, to call me a thief. If stories like this one, about the moment somebody finally stops explaining themselves to people who never intended to listen, are the kind you come back for, I'd love for you to subscribe to Revenge Lab. We tell true, honest stories about ordinary people who ran out of patience at exactly the right time, and I think you're going to want to be here for what happened next, because I promise you, the woman who stood up in that parlor had no idea what was sitting in a locked drawer 4 miles away, waiting for me to find it. I set my coffee cup down on the sideboard, very carefully, so it wouldn't rattle in my hand, and I looked at my sister across a room full of our family's oldest friends. "I didn't take anything out of this house," I said. "But Vivian, if something's actually missing, I think we should call the police right now together and find out exactly what happened to it." I watched something flicker across her face when I said that. Not guilt, not yet. I wasn't sophisticated enough yet, that afternoon, to read her that closely. Just a small, fast recalculation, the kind you do when someone hands you back a card you didn't expect them to have. "There's no need to make a scene," she said. I hadn't raised my voice at all. I want that on the record, the way I've wanted a great many things on the record since that day. I hadn't raised my voice, and my sister was already telling me not to make one. I need to back up 11 days, to the actual morning Aunt Jo died, because the accusation in that parlor didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a very specific hour that Vivian had clearly been building a story around since before the funeral home ever got there. The call came in at 6:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I still have it logged on my phone, and because I've looked at that log more times in the past year than I'd like to admit. Miss Maggie, Corinne Weaver's voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it was taking her to keep it that way. Corinne had kept house for my aunt for 31 years, longer than I'd been running my own business, longer than Vivian had been married. I think you need to come. I think Miss Joe passed in the night. I was dressed and in my car in under 6 minutes. Aunt Joe's house was 14 minutes from mine on a good morning, no traffic, and I made it in 10. She was in her reading chair by the window, not in her bed, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. Worse because it meant she'd been up in the night and hadn't wanted to wake anyone. Better because it meant, at 91 years old, she'd gone exactly the way she would have chosen, with a book open on her lap and the lamp still on. I stood in that doorway longer than I probably needed to, taking in the details the way I catalog anything, automatically, almost against my will, even in grief. The book was a biography of a shipping magnate she'd been reading for weeks, a bookmark tucked 3 chapters from the end. Her reading glasses had slipped down onto the arm of the chair rather than her face, which told me she'd likely closed her eyes to rest them for a moment rather than to sleep. On the side table sat her evening cup of tea, barely touched, gone cold hours before anyone found her. I remember thinking, absurdly, that she would have hated leaving a full cup of good Earl Grey to go to waste, and that the thought made me laugh once, a short, strange sound in an otherwise silent house, before it turned immediately into something closer to tears. Corinne had already called the emergency line. What she hadn't done yet, because she was standing in the front hall shaking too hard to hold the phone steady, was call my mother, or my sister, or the funeral home, or anyone else. She'd called me first, because for 31 years, whenever anything in that house needed handling with care instead of panic, Corinne had learned that I was the one who showed up and handled it. I sat with Corinne at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour, waiting for the medical examiner's van, both of us drinking coffee we didn't taste, both of us occasionally saying some small, useless thing about Aunt Joe, how she'd always kept that same reading lamp even after Corinne found her 3 better ones at estate sales, how she'd finished the crossword the day before and left it folded open on the hall table like she meant to check the answers later. I called my mother at 6:40. I called Vivian at 6:52 because I tried Vivian first and got no answer, and by the time she called back it was closer to 7. That's the hour Vivian would later describe to 40 people holding paper plates as the hour I was alone in the house with the safe unlocked. 1 hour, with Corinne present the entire time, both of us sitting at a kitchen table 3 rooms away from any safe, doing nothing more sinister than trying to remember which hymn Aunt Joe had once said she wanted played at her funeral. I didn't know, sitting at that table, that the story of that hour would already be halfway built by the time I saw my sister again. I didn't know that Vivian had, in fact, been inside that house twice in the 10 days between that morning and the funeral, using a key nobody had thought to ask her to return. And I didn't know, not yet, that my aunt, patient, sharp, deliberately underestimated her whole life by people who mistook her quietness for softness, had spent the last 22 years of her life quietly preparing for a day exactly like the one that was coming. I want to tell you who Josephine Calder actually was, because the version of her that got repeated at that funeral reception, sweet, eccentric, a little forgetful in her final years, was only ever the version convenient for the people telling it. She opened the Calder cabinet on Bull Street in 1971, when she was 36 years old and recently widowed, with money she'd saved herself and a small loan she'd had to get 3 different banks to even consider giving a woman without a husband's signature on the application. 52 years later, when she died, that shop had appraised, sold, or authenticated pieces that ended up in 2 Smithsonian collections and a private sale that made the front page of the arts section in 3 different newspapers. I started working there the summer I turned 16, sorting estate boxes for $4 an hour, and I never really stopped. Vivian, 2 years younger than me, came exactly twice, once because our mother made her, once because she wanted spending money for a school trip, and both times she left within the hour, bored, restless, uninterested in anything that didn't come with a price tag already attached and visible. Your sister likes things, Aunt Joe told me once, when I was maybe 20, sorting a box of estate letters at her kitchen table while she went through invoices with her reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair. You like knowing where things came from. That's not the same thing, Margaret, and it never will be, no matter how much your mother wants it to be. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. I understand it completely now. Jo taught me everything about the trade the old way, not from a textbook, but sitting beside her at that same kitchen table, watching her handle 150 years of somebody else's letters like they still belonged to the person who wrote them. She taught me how a signature ages, how ink oxidizes differently depending on the iron content, how to tell a genuine period binding from a clever modern forgery by the way the thread pulls at the spine. She taught me the shop's own private cost code, the one she'd used on the back of every price tag since 1971, a 10-letter word with no repeating letters that stood in for the numbers 0 through 9, so that any customer who flipped a tag over saw nothing but a harmless string of consonants instead of what she'd actually paid. Every dealer worth their salt has one, she said, the day she taught it to me, writing it out on the back of an old receipt. Mine's Cumberland. C is 1, U is 2, all the way down. Learn it, and don't ever write it down anywhere somebody else might find it. I learned it. I never forgot it. I had no idea, at 20 years old, memorizing a code word over a cup of coffee at my aunt's kitchen table, exactly how much that particular piece of knowledge was going to matter 39 years later. What I understood even less back then was the other system running quietly underneath the shop's business, a private shorthand Jo used only in her personal ledgers, the ones she kept separate from the business books, for tracking money that moved between family rather than customers. It had started, she told me once, half laughing, as a joke from a Sunday dinner sometime in the 1980s, when my grandmother had teased that every family needs its birds, the ones who build, the ones who show off, the ones who take what shines and never say where it went. I was the magpie, Jo told me, drawn to old things, quiet, collecting what other people overlooked. She never told me, not once in 22 years, what she called my sister. I found that out myself, much later, in a drawer I wasn't supposed to open for months. There's one afternoon from that apprenticeship I've thought about more than any other since Jo died, though I didn't understand its weight at the time. I was maybe 25, helping her close out the shop's books for the year, when Vivian called asking to borrow the good silver for a dinner party she was hosting for Preston's parents, their first real meeting, high stakes. Vivian's voice pitched a full register higher than usual with nerves. Jo agreed without hesitation, wrapped 4-place settings herself in tissue paper, and drove them over personally rather than trust the mail. But after she got back, she sat back down across from me at that kitchen table and was quiet for a long moment, turning her pen over in her fingers the way she did when she was deciding whether a thought was worth saying out loud. Your sister asked me, very casually on the porch just now, whether I'd already decided what happens to the house someday, she said finally. 9 months before she's even had this man's parents to dinner. I want you to notice that, Margaret, not because it means anything terrible on its own. People wonder about things like that, but I want you to notice how she asked it, like she already had an answer in mind, and was just checking whether the world agreed with her yet. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was one comment, one dinner party, one slightly awkward question a 23-year-old might ask without any real calculation behind it at all. I filed it away the way you file away most small, ordinary moments in a family, without weight, without consequence. Jo, apparently, filed it away differently. I understand that now. The will was read 9 days after the funeral, in the paneled conference room of Fenwick and Doyle, the firm that had handled Aunt Jo's affairs for as long as I could remember. Walter Fenwick himself sat at the head of the table, 70-something, precise, the kind of lawyer who still used a fountain pen for his own notes, even though everything on the table in front of him was printed. My mother sat between Vivian and me, which felt less like comfort and more like a referee's assignment. Preston, Vivian's husband, sat on her other side in a suit that looked slightly too new for the occasion, checking his watch twice before Walter had even opened the folder. Walter read through the preliminary language first, sound mind, revoking all prior wills, the standard architecture of these documents, and then got to the part everyone in that room had actually come for. To my mother, Eleanor Calder, Joe left a modest cash bequest and a collection of family photographs going back 4 generations, along with the instruction that she was the only one of us who never once asked me for a single dollar, and I have never forgotten that. To Vivian, Joe left the house on Habersham Street, appraised, Walter noted, at just over $1.1 million, along with the bulk of her investment portfolio, roughly $1.4 million across several accounts, structured to transfer with minimal tax burden. I watched my sister's shoulders come down half an inch when Walter said that number. I watched Preston's hand find her knee under the table. Then Walter turned the page and got to my portion, and I felt the room's attention shift toward me the way it always does when people are waiting to see if the smaller number is going to produce a reaction worth watching. To me, Joe left the Calder cabinet itself, the business, its inventory, and the modest commercial building it operated out of on Bull Street, along with a specific bequest of the roll-top desk and its contents, currently located in the workshop, along with any personal papers Margaret finds within it, which are hers to keep or dispose of as she sees fit. A separate cash bequest, $50,000, was attached, described only as for whatever repairs the desk requires. On paper, in that room, it looked exactly the way Vivian would spend the next several weeks telling people it looked. She'd gotten a house and over $1 million in cash and stock. I'd gotten a struggling little antique shop and an old desk nobody in the family had ever paid much attention to, sitting in a back room that smelled like linseed oil and dust. I didn't feel slighted, sitting in that conference room. I felt something closer to recognition. Joe had left me work, not a windfall, and work was the one thing she'd always trusted me to actually want. Vivian didn't see it that way. I watched her face while Walter finished reading, and I watched her decide, in real time, exactly what story she was going to tell about that imbalance before anyone else in the family had a chance to form their own opinion. "That desk is worth what?" she said, not quite a question once Walter had closed the folder. "A few $100s. Maybe 1,000 if it's got good bones." "I haven't appraised it," I said. "I don't appraise things I haven't looked at closely, Vivian. You know that about me." "I know Aunt Jo left me a house I have to pay taxes on and sell furniture out of to cover the transfer costs," Vivian said, "well, you got a business that actually makes money and $50,000 in cash on top of it for a desk. I'm just saying the math is interesting." I didn't answer her. I'd learned, over 59 years of being her older sister, that answering Vivian in the moment she wanted an answer almost never went anywhere good. My mother caught up to me in the parking lot afterward, her keys still in her hand, not quite looking at me directly. "You're not upset," she said, half a question, like she needed me to confirm it before she'd allow herself to feel settled about it too. "I'm not upset," I said, and meant it, though I could see she didn't entirely believe me. "Jo knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote that will, Mom. I trust that more than I trust how it looks on paper today." "Vivian doesn't see it that way." "Vivian rarely sees anything the way it actually is," I said, gently enough that it didn't sound like the accusation it technically was. My mother didn't argue with me. She also didn't agree, not out loud, and I remember driving home that afternoon thinking that her silence had already told me more than any argument would have. What I didn't say out loud, sitting in that conference room, was the question already forming in the back of my mind, the one I wouldn't be able to fully answer for another 2 months. Why would Joe attach a specific $50,000 repair allowance to a desk that, by every appearance, needed nothing more than a fresh coat of wax? Vivian moved into the Habersham Street house 11 days after the will reading. I know because I drove past it on my way to the shop, not intentionally. I want to be honest about that. It's simply on my route, and saw a moving truck backed up onto Aunt Jo's lawn. 2 men carrying out a federal period sideboard I'd personally appraised for Jo's insurance 3 years earlier. I pulled over. I told myself I was only stopping to see if she needed help. "We're just clearing out some of the bigger pieces," Vivian said, standing on the porch with a clipboard, dressed like she was hosting an open house rather than moving into her dead aunt's home. "Preston's decorator thinks the house needs to feel like ours," not like a museum. That sideboard's federal, Vivian. It's worth close to $40,000. Where's it going? A consignment place Preston knows. We need the cash flow for the renovation. She said it breezily, like renovation budgets were the most natural thing in the world to discuss 11 days after a funeral. You should let me sell some of that shop inventory too, honestly. Half of it's just sitting there depreciating. It's not depreciating, I said. It's appreciating, most of it, which is the entire point of the business Joe left me. She didn't answer that. She just wrote something on her clipboard and told the movers to be careful with the corner of the frame going through the door. I want to tell you honestly that I stood on that lawn for a long moment after that conversation, watching pieces of my aunt's life get carried out into a truck less than 2 weeks after her funeral, and I felt something that surprised me. Not rage, not yet, but a kind of low, steady grief for how fast a house can stop being a home and start being inventory. I didn't say anything else. I got back in my car and drove to the shop, and I didn't come back to Habersham Street for 3 more weeks, which turned out to be exactly long enough for Vivian to finish building the version of events she needed everyone else to believe before I ever thought to look closely at what was actually missing. By the end of that first month, 3 more pieces had left the house through the same consignment arrangement: a set of hand-painted Chinese export porcelain, a small collection of first edition travel books Joe had kept in the front hall, and though I didn't know it yet, something considerably more valuable than any of those. Corinne called me the second week of April, her voice low, like she was worried about being overheard in a house she no longer technically worked in, since Vivian had let her go within the first 10 days. "Miss Maggie," she said, "I don't like what I've been seeing over there. I know it's not really my place anymore, but I think somebody ought to know." Before Corinne told me what she'd seen, I need to tell you what those same 3 weeks looked like from the outside, because I didn't understand, until much later, how completely my sister had already rebuilt the family's opinion of me before I'd even finished unpacking my own grief. It started with a group text. My cousin Denise sent me a screenshot of it 2 days after the moving truck, apologizing before she'd even explained why. It was a thread among 6 cousins on my father's side, started by Vivian, laying out, in 3 long paragraphs, exactly what she'd said in the parlor: the brooch, the prints, the cash, the hour I'd supposedly spent alone with an unlocked safe. "I hate that I even have to say this about my own sister," the message read, "but I think we all need to be careful about what gets said around her right now, at least until this gets sorted out." Nobody in that thread asked me directly. That's the detail that stayed with me longest. 6 people who'd known me my entire life, and not one of them thought to simply call and ask what actually happened before deciding how careful they needed to be around me. My Aunt Patris, my father's younger sister, called our mother instead of calling me, and told her, in a tone my mother later described as somewhere between concerned and thrilled, that it explains so much, honestly, about how competitive Margaret's always been underneath that quiet exterior. I'd spoken to Patris maybe 4 times in the previous decade. She'd apparently formed a complete theory of my character from a single unverified accusation in under 72 hours. Even a longtime client of mine, a woman named Frances Odom who'd used Calder provenance to authenticate her late husband's stamp collection 2 years earlier, called the shop to ask, delicately, whether everything was all right after hearing some talk at her book club. I answered that call myself, calm, professional, the way I answer every call, and told her I appreciated her checking in rather than simply believing the talk. She stayed a client. Not everyone did. I want to be honest about how that month actually felt, underneath the composed version of myself I was showing my family. It felt like watching a room slowly empty out around me while I was still standing in the middle of it, unable to explain fast enough or loud enough to stop people from leaving. I understood, even then, that raising my voice about it would only confirm whatever version of me Vivian had already sold them. So I didn't. I went to the shop every morning. I did the work in front of me, and I let the silence around my own name get louder before I ever said a single word in my own defense. It was Corinne's call, 2 weeks into that quiet, that finally gave me something to do besides simply endure it. I met Corinne at her own kitchen table, a small yellow walled room in a house 2 streets over from where she'd worked for 3 decades. And she poured us both coffee with hands that were steadier now than they'd been the morning Joe died, but still careful. The way people get careful when they are about to say something they've been turning over for a long time. I stopped by twice, she said, in that first week and a half before the funeral. Miss Vivian had already changed the locks, but she let me in each time, said she needed help finding Miss Joe's good dress for the viewing. First time that was true, we did find the dress. Second time, she paused, wrapping both hands around her mug. Second time, she sent me upstairs to look for a hat box, and I was gone maybe 15 minutes. When I came back down, she had a little leather case sitting open on the hall table. I saw the sapphire brooch in it, plain as day, Miss Maggie, and a few other pieces from the jewelry box upstairs. Did you say anything? I asked if she was taking those to be cleaned for the funeral, Corinne said. She said yes. Said she wanted everything to look right for the viewing, for the family photos. She shook her head slowly. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? I'd known that woman since she was 7 years old, sitting on Miss Joe's porch steps. And the brooch never came back. Not that I ever saw. And I was let go 3 days after that, Miss Maggie. No warning. Just a call telling me my services wouldn't be needed going forward under the new arrangement. I've thought about that timing a lot, sitting here by myself since. I sat with that information for a long moment, turning my own coffee cup in a slow circle on Corinne's table, feeling the shape of something start to take form that I didn't want to be true yet. There's one more thing, Corinne said. The safe. Miss Joe had me there the day she changed that combination, back in the winter. Didn't tell me why exactly, just said she wanted it changed and that only she and the bank knew the new numbers. I always wondered about that. Wondered if something had happened that she never told me the whole of. I hadn't known about the combination change. Nobody had told me, and it wasn't in anything Walter Fenwick had shared with the family. It was a small detail, easy to overlook in the middle of everything else, but sitting in Corinne's kitchen, it settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending out ripples I couldn't yet see the edges of. One other thing bothered me, and I don't know what to make of it, Corinne added, almost as an afterthought, the way people do when they're not sure something is even worth mentioning. That second visit, before she sent me up for the hat box, Miss Vivian asked me, out of nowhere, whether I knew if that old roll-top desk in the shop workshop still worked the way it used to, whether the writing surface still folded down right, whether I'd ever seen your aunt keep anything valuable in it. I told her I didn't know, that it wasn't really my business, the shop side of things. She didn't ask again, but I've thought about that too, sitting here. Struck me odd that a woman moving furniture out of a house would care so much about one particular desk sitting 2 miles away in a shop she'd never once shown any interest in. I felt something cold move through me, hearing that. I didn't understand it yet, not fully, not until months later, sitting on that workshop floor with a false bottom finally open in front of me. But some old instinct told me, even then, that Vivian had been looking for something specific, and hadn't found it before I did. Corinne, I said, would you be willing to say all of this to a lawyer if it ever came to that? Not because I want to drag you into anything, because I think you might be the only person who actually knows what happened in that house before the rest of us did. She looked at me for a long moment, the particular steady look of a woman who'd spent 31 years being careful about what she said inside that family's walls, and who had clearly decided, sometime in the past few weeks, that her carefulness had run its course. I'll say it under oath if I have to, she said. I loved that woman 31 years. I'm not about to let somebody paint over what she actually knew before she died. I didn't go looking for the ledger. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I wasn't hunting for evidence the day I found it. I was simply doing the work Joe had left me to do, which was exactly the kind of quiet, patient labor she'd always trusted me with, and never once trusted Vivian to sit still long enough to finish. The roll-top desk had sat in the back workshop of the Calder cabinet for as long as I could remember, half buried under drop cloths and boxes of unsorted estate paper, the kind of piece regular customers walked past without a second glance. Cherry wood, mid-19th century, a working timbre that stuck a little in humid weather. Joe had always called it the desk nobody wants, which I'd assumed, for 30 years, was simply true. I started restoring it on a Sunday afternoon in early May, mostly because the $50,000 repair allowance Joe had attached to it in her will was too specific a number to ignore. And because some instinct I couldn't fully name told me that a woman who'd spent 50 years pricing things down to the exact digit didn't attach a number like that to a piece of furniture on a whim. The shop was quiet that Sunday, the way it always was on the one day a week we didn't open. Just the sound of the ceiling fan turning overhead and, faintly, traffic out on Bull Street. I'd brought my own tools from home rather than use the shop's, a habit Joe had drilled into me decades earlier, that a piece this old deserved a steady hand working with instruments that hand actually trusted. I laid out a clean canvas drop cloth, set my loop and picks in a neat row the way she'd taught me, and started the way I start everything, with the least invasive step first. Simply looking, for a long time, before I ever touched a single surface with a tool. I worked the way I always work, slow, methodical, checking every joint and panel before I touched anything with a tool. 3 hours in, running my hand along the underside of the writing surface, checking for the kind of hairline cracking that ruins a piece's value if you don't catch it early, I felt something that shouldn't have been there. A seam. Too straight, too deliberate to be a natural split in the wood. I want to tell you my hands were steady when I found it. They weren't. It took me nearly 20 minutes, working with a thin steel pick and more patience than I usually need for this kind of thing, to understand that the desk's writing surface had a false bottom, a shallow compartment, no more than 1.5 inches deep, built with the same craftsmanship as the rest of the piece, meant to be found only by someone who already knew exactly where and how carefully to look. Inside were 4 things. A cloth-bound ledger, its cover soft with age and handling. A smaller notebook, newer, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore, its pages dense with Joe's handwriting. A sealed envelope with my name on it, in ink so familiar my chest tightened before I'd even touched it. And a second sealed envelope, unaddressed, tucked beneath the first, its flap pressed down but not glued, like Joe had meant to add something to it and never quite finished. I sat on the floor of that workshop for a long time before I opened anything. The drop cloths still pooled around me, dust motes turning slow circles in the late afternoon light coming through the high back window, and I understood, even before I'd read a single word, that Joe had built this compartment on purpose, for exactly the moment I was sitting in. I opened my own envelope first. Margaret, if you're reading this, you've done the one thing I always trusted you to do eventually, which is look closely at something everyone else decided wasn't worth the trouble. Everything else in this drawer is going to make more sense once you remember Cumberland. Take your time with it. I did. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I reached for the ledger. The ledger's first pages were exactly what I expected, decades of ordinary shop business, entries for pieces bought and sold, running back to the year the cabinet opened, written in the same private cost code Joe had taught me at her kitchen table when I was 20 years old. C1, U2, M3, B4, E5, R6, L7, A8, N9, D0. I could still read it as easily as my own handwriting, 39 years after she'd first shown it to me. But somewhere around the middle of the ledger, the entries changed. The dates were still there, the code was still there, but the items being tracked weren't antiques anymore. March, loan V. Tuition, Savannah Country Day, both children, Ralk. I sat with that for a moment before the code resolved itself. R6, A8, L7, L7, C1. $68,701. I checked the year. The entry was from the spring both of Vivian's children had started at the private school on the east side of town, the one Vivian had once told our entire extended family. At a Thanksgiving dinner, I still remembered clearly that she and Preston had worked so hard to be able to afford on our own. I turned the page. Another entry 18 months later. Down payment, Habersham house purchase. Advance against V's eventual share. A figure that resolved once I ran the code to $150,000. I want to tell you I felt triumphant reading those first 2 entries. I didn't. I felt something closer to sick, a slow, spreading nausea, because I understood immediately what I was looking at, not just proof that Vivian had lied about the missing brooch, which was still weeks away from being fully proven. Proof that she had spent years, publicly, at family dinners and church functions, and every gathering our extended family ever held, quietly building a story about being the overlooked sister, the one Joe never helped the way she'd apparently helped me, while privately receiving sums of money large enough to buy a house. I kept reading. An entry for a wedding contribution, $60,000, dated the year of Vivian and Preston's anniversary party, the one where Vivian had stood up and thanked everyone except Aunt Jo, who couldn't be bothered to help us start our life together. A line I remembered because it had stung at the time, watching Joe's face go carefully neutral across the reception hall. An entry 4 years later for $220,000, marked simply, Preston's first venture. Failed within the year. Not recorded as a gift, advance against V's share, documented, witnessed by Walter F. I stopped there for a long moment, looking at that phrase. Witnessed by Walter F. Which meant Walter Fenwick, sitting across the conference table from all of us at that will reading, already knew about every single one of these entries, and had watched Vivian accept a house and over $1 million without correcting a single word she'd said about the math being interesting. I understood, sitting on that workshop floor with dust in my lungs and my aunt's handwriting spread across my knees, that Walter's silence hadn't been an oversight. It had been Joe's own instruction, held in trust exactly as carefully as everything else in that drawer, waiting for me to find it on my own timeline rather than his. I turned to the final entries in the main ledger, dated within the last year of Joe's life, and found the sentence that told me exactly how deliberately she had built all of this. I am recording every dollar, as I have for 22 years, because I know my niece well enough to know that the day I die, she will stand in this house and tell the family she never got a dime from me. When that day comes, Margaret will need proof, because I won't be here to say it myself. The smaller notebook was newer, the pages less brittle, and it took me longer to understand what I was reading, because it wasn't written in numbers at all. It was written in birds. The magpie stayed late again tonight, sorting the Hendricks estate letters, didn't even ask for overtime. The peacock came by for lunch, spent the whole hour talking about the renovation and never once asked how I was feeling, though she certainly noticed the new lamp. I remembered, reading that, the joke my grandmother had made decades earlier at a Sunday dinner, half a lifetime ago, about the birds every family needs, the ones who build, the ones who show off, the ones who take what shines. I'd always assumed it had been a passing comment, forgotten within the week. Jo had apparently carried it for 30 years and turned it quietly into her own private shorthand for exactly who each of us actually was. Entry after entry, spanning nearly a decade, the notebook painted a picture I'd never once been allowed to see while Jo was alive, small, specific observations about Vivian that Jo had clearly never said out loud to anyone, recorded instead in a code only I would ever be able to read, in a compartment only I would ever think to look for. The peacock asked again today about the safe combination, said she just wanted to know in case of emergency. I changed it the following week. I don't believe her emergencies the way I used to. The peacock mentioned, very casually, that she'd heard the federal sideboard was worth quite a bit now. I've started keeping closer track of what's cataloged in this house, not just the shop. The peacock asked about the old roll-top desk today, out of nowhere, wanted to know if it still worked properly. I told her it needed too much restoration to bother with. That was a lie. I have never once lied to that girl about a piece's condition in 50 years of this business, and I did it without blinking, because some part of me has already decided I don't trust her within 10 feet of anything I actually care about protecting. I sat with that entry longer than any of the others, understanding, finally, the shape of what Corinne had described to me weeks earlier at her own kitchen table, Vivian, standing in that front hall, asking an offhand question about a desk she'd never shown a moment's interest in her entire life. Jo had noticed the same thing I would notice, months later, sitting on this exact workshop floor. She just hadn't waited for the moment to explain itself. She'd simply changed her answer, quietly, and made certain the one true thing in that desk would still be there for the one person who'd know how to actually find it. And then, dated only 6 weeks before she died, an entry that made the hair on my arms stand up when I read it. The peacock will come back for more, and she will bring lawyers with her this time, dressed up as grief. I can feel it coming the way you feel weather change in an old joint. Make sure the magpie has proof before she needs it, because I won't be here to hand it to her in time. I sat on that workshop floor for what felt like an hour, though it was probably closer to 20 minutes. Holding a notebook my aunt had filled with warnings about a future she'd somehow predicted with unsettling precision, months before it happened. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters for everything that came after. My first instinct, reading that, wasn't triumph. It was grief, a fresh, specific grief, for a woman who had spent the final years of her life quietly bracing for exactly this betrayal, alone, without ever once burdening me with the weight of watching for it too. I picked up the second envelope, the unaddressed one, the one whose flap hadn't been fully sealed, and I understood, holding it, that whatever was inside it had been the very last thing Joe had added to that drawer. I didn't open it that day. Some instinct told me to wait, that whatever was in it deserved a moment I wasn't ready to give it yet, sitting alone on a workshop floor with dust still settling around me, and my sister's whole, carefully built story starting to come apart in my hands. I put everything back in the false bottom exactly as I'd found it, closed the desk's timbre, and drove home in silence, turning one single sentence over and over in my mind the entire way. Make sure the magpie has proof before she needs it. I was going to need it. I understood that now, with a clarity that settled something cold and steady into my chest. The only question left was how long I could wait to use it. I spent the next 3 weeks doing something I imagine would have made Joe proud, if she'd been able to watch me do it, building a spreadsheet. I transcribed every coded entry from the main ledger, running each figure through Cumberland twice to check my own math. Cross-referencing dates against family events, I remembered clearly enough to confirm the pattern. By the time I finished, the total came to $685,000 in documented advances to Vivian over 22 years. Tuition, the house down payment, the wedding, Preston's failed venture, and in the very last entry, dated 6 months before Joe's death, a final $75,000, marked only, for Preston's new fund against her share. I no longer believe I'll see this repaid, but I am recording it anyway because someone should. $685,000, nearly 3 times what Vivian was now publicly accusing me of stealing. I checked one entry against my own memory before I trusted any of it completely, because that's simply how I was trained to work, never take a document's word alone, always cross-reference against something independent. The wedding entry, $60,000, was dated 3 weeks before Vivian and Preston's anniversary party, the one where she'd stood up and thanked everyone except Aunt Jo, who couldn't be bothered to help us start our life together. I still had the photographs from that night on an old hard drive, time-stamped, and I pulled them up that same evening, Jo in the back of the reception hall in a blue dress, her face carefully neutral while my sister delivered that line into a microphone. I remembered thinking, at the time, that Jo simply had a talent for looking unbothered by things that clearly weren't sitting well with her. I understood it differently now. She'd already written Vivian a check large enough to cover half that reception, 3 weeks earlier, and she'd sat through the insult anyway, without correcting a single word of it in front of the family. I didn't do anything with that spreadsheet right away. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think this is the part of the story that people who have lived something similar will understand best. I wasn't ready yet. Not because I doubted what I'd found. I'd checked the math too many times to doubt it. I wasn't ready because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to believe there was a version of this where Vivian, confronted privately, quietly, without an audience, might simply tell the truth and let this go before it had to become a battle fought with lawyers and paper trails. I called her. It was a Thursday evening, early June, and I sat in my own kitchen with the spreadsheet open on my laptop, working up to a conversation I'd rehearsed in my head at least a dozen times that afternoon. Vivian, I said, once she'd picked up, I want to talk about the brooch. And the prince. Privately, just us, before this goes any further with the family. There's nothing to talk about, she said. You know what you did. I didn't do anything, I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I've learned to keep it level in rooms far more hostile than a phone call with my own sister. But I think you might know more about where those items actually went than you've been telling people. There was a pause on the line, just long enough that I understood I'd landed closer to something than I'd expected to, this early in the conversation. "Are you accusing me of something?" she said, and her voice had gone very flat, very careful. "I'm asking you a question. One time, privately, before I ask it any other way. I don't have to answer to you, Margaret. You got the business. You got the desk. You got $50,000 for furniture repairs, and now you want to accuse me of stealing from my own inheritance. Do you hear yourself?" I sat with that for a moment, the specific, practiced outrage of it, and I understood that whatever conversation I'd hoped to have wasn't the one I was actually going to get. "I'm not accusing you of anything yet," I said. "I'm giving you a chance to tell me the truth before this gets bigger than either of us can control. The only person who needs to tell the truth in this family is you," Vivian said, and hung up before I could answer. I sat in my kitchen a long time after that call ended, looking at a spreadsheet full of numbers my aunt had spent 22 years quietly documenting, and I made a decision that would define everything that came after. I wasn't going to call her again. I wasn't going to argue with her at family dinners, or defend myself at another gathering the way I'd had to at the funeral reception. I was going to do exactly what Jo had spent her whole life teaching me to do with a piece of paper nobody else trusted. I was going to verify every single detail, patiently, quietly, until the proof was strong enough that no amount of tears in any room could talk anyone out of believing it. The weeks that followed weren't dramatic. Most of it was work. Walter Fenwick confirmed, carefully, that he'd personally witnessed 3 of the advancement documents in Jo's ledger. "I signed as witness myself," he said. "That's a matter of record whether I want it convenient or not." It was the first outside confirmation I had, a professional's name, already on paper, independent of anything I'd found in that desk. But it only proved what Vivian had received. It didn't yet prove what she'd done with the brooch and the prints in the 10 days after Jo died. So I went back to what I actually knew how to do. I called 3 colleagues in the estate and antiques trade, people who trusted my judgment enough not to ask too many questions, and asked them to keep an eye out for a federal sideboard and a matched pair of Audubon elephant folio prints that had recently left a private Savannah collection. I didn't tell any of them whose collection. The trade's memory works slowly, through casual conversation. I only needed to plant the question and wait. It took 6 weeks, and I want to be honest about how long 6 weeks felt while Vivian kept telling the story at church, at the country club, at every family gathering that summer, that I'd swept Aunt Jo's house clean before the lawyer ever arrived. My mother mentioned, over a lunch gone quiet in ways it never used to be, that people are asking questions, Margaret, and I don't always know what to tell them. "Tell them I'll have proof, eventually," I said. "Eventually," she repeated, like the word itself unsettled her. I didn't hand anything over yet. I wasn't going to give proof this significant to a family that hadn't asked me a single real question first. I was going to make them ask, and then make sure the answer was undeniable. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in July, hand-delivered by a process server who caught me in my own driveway with a bag of groceries still in my arms. Margaret Calder, "You've been served." Vivian Calder Ashworth v. Margaret Calder, complaint for conversion, unjust enrichment, and breach of fiduciary duty. She was suing me formally through an attorney named Bradley Hutchins, whose firm I recognized from billboards along the interstate. The complaint alleged I'd removed the brooch, the prints, and $40,000 in cash from the safe during the hour I'd waited with Corrine, in a position of trust the defendant deliberately abused. I read it twice, standing in my own driveway with the eggs slowly warming and a neighbor's sprinkler ticking somewhere down the block, and I want to be honest about what actually went through me in that moment, because it wasn't quite fear, and it wasn't quite anger. It was something closer to disbelief at the specificity of it, the exact dollar figures, the precise language of position of trust, all of it typed up formally by a stranger in a downtown office who had never met me, built entirely out of my sister's word. Seeing an accusation dressed up in a court caption does something a parlor full of gossip never quite manages. It makes the lie look, for a moment, almost official. I called Delphine Ortiz before I'd even made it inside with the groceries. She'd been my closest friend since we were 26, and 31 years into a trusts and estates career, she didn't need much explanation to know exactly what she was looking at. "This is thin," she said, once I'd read it to her. "Designed to scare you into a quiet settlement before anyone looks closely. Bring me everything tonight." I told her about the ledger, the notebook, Corinne's account of the leather case in the front hall. "Once we use what's in that desk," Delphine said, "there's no putting it back in the drawer. Your sister's about to learn the woman she's called a thief for months kept better records than anyone in this family ever imagined." "Good," I said. "Let's go through everything." The break came from an estate jeweler named Selwyn Marsh, a quiet, precise man in his 60s who'd bought and sold fine jewelry out of a small shop on Whitaker Street for as long as I'd been in the trade myself. He called me on a Thursday afternoon in late July, his voice careful in a way that told me immediately he'd heard something worth following before he'd even said a word. "Maggie," he said, "you asked me a while back to keep an eye out for anything matching an old Calder piece. Sapphire and diamond brooch, Edwardian setting, roughly $85,000 in appraised value." My stomach tightened. "You found it." "I bought it," he said, and I could hear the discomfort in his voice, the particular discomfort of a man realizing, after the fact, that he might have bought something he shouldn't have. "Private sale, back in March, about 10 days after your aunt passed, if the timing means what I think it might mean now. A woman came in directly, no consignment paperwork, wanted cash rather than a check. Said it was a family piece she needed to liquidate quickly for an urgent expense. Do you have a name?" "I have a driver's license I photocopied, which is my standard practice for anything over $10,000. He paused. "Maggie, it's a Vivian Ashworth. I didn't put it together until a colleague mentioned you'd been asking around about a matching set of Audubon prints too, and something about the timing started bothering me enough that I pulled my own file." I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd built my spreadsheet weeks earlier, and felt the last piece of doubt I'd still been quietly carrying finally give way completely. I thought about that brooch while I sat there, the actual object itself, not just its dollar value. Our grandmother had worn it in the one photograph we had of her wedding, a small, formal portrait Joe kept on the mantel for as long as I could remember, sapphires set in an Edwardian starburst pattern that had gone slightly out of true over a century of handling. Joe used to let me hold it carefully over a velvet cloth when I was learning how to examine a piece without damaging it, and she'd always said the same thing, half a joke and half not. "This one's not for sale, Margaret, not ever, no matter what anybody offers." I understood, sitting at my kitchen table with Selwyn's call still ringing in my ear, that Vivian hadn't just sold a valuable object. She'd sold the one piece in that entire estate Joe had explicitly, repeatedly, said was never supposed to leave the family at all. "Selwyn," I said, "would you be willing to give that documentation to my attorney? Formally, under oath if it comes to that." "I don't love the position it puts me in," he said, honestly. "But I bought a piece I now believe may not have been legally hers to sell, and I'd rather make that right than spend the next several years wondering if I helped someone get away with something. Yes, send your attorney my way." I called Delphine the moment we hung up, and I could hear, in the particular energy of her voice once I'd told her, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "That's the piece that changes everything," she said. "Maggie, do you understand what this means? Your sister sold that brooch 10 days after your aunt's death, weeks before she ever publicly accused you of taking it. She wasn't reacting to a theft. She was covering for one she'd already committed and building a story in advance to make sure nobody ever looked in her direction." "I need the prints too," I said. "If she sold the brooch privately, in a hurry, for cash, I don't think the Audubons went the same route. Those are too recognizable to move quietly through a small private sale. Then let's find out where a nervous person tries to sell something too valuable to hide easily," Delphine said. "My guess is an auction house, somewhere far enough from Savannah that she assumed nobody in your world would ever see it cross a block." She was right. It took another 11 days, and it came from exactly the kind of small, specific detail that only someone in my profession would ever think to look for. A colleague of mine, a print specialist named Odell Marsh, no relation to Selwyn, a coincidence that made both of us laugh quietly the first time we realized it, called me from a regional auction preview in Charleston, where he'd been asked to authenticate a small run of natural history prints ahead of an upcoming sale. "Maggie," he said, "I think you need to see something before this goes to auction next week." He sent photographs within the hour. A matched pair of Audubon elephant folio prints, consigned under a name I didn't recognize, a private collector requesting anonymity, according to the auction house's own catalog notes. But on the back of each print, in the lower left corner, was a tiny stamped mark I recognized instantly, because I'd seen it on nearly every significant piece that had ever passed through my aunt's hands. A small circular stamp reading J.C., alongside a 4-digit inventory number in Joe's own careful hand, a system she'd used for 40 years to track provenance on anything she'd personally authenticated for insurance purposes. "Those are Joe's," I told Odell. "Both of them. I can give you the exact insurance appraisal from 3 years ago if the auction house needs independent confirmation." "The consignor's name on file is a Rebecca Sorrell," Odell said. "Address in Bluffton, South Carolina. Does that mean anything to you?" It didn't, not immediately. But Delphine found it within a day, running the name through public records with the specific, patient thoroughness I'd come to rely on completely by that point in the summer. Rebecca Sorrell was Preston's cousin, a woman with no personal connection to the antiques trade, no history of collecting, who had, as far as any record showed, never once purchased or sold a piece of fine art in her life, until the week she'd apparently consigned a pair of prints worth well over $100,000 to a Charleston auction house, using her own name to keep Vivian's off the paperwork entirely. "This isn't panic," Delphine said once she'd laid it out across her kitchen table. "First, a quiet private sale for cash. Then, when the prints proved too recognizable to move that way, a relative's name to keep hers off the paperwork. This is planning, Maggie, done in the first 2 weeks after your aunt died, long before she ever stood up in that parlor and accused you of anything. She'd already written the ending. She just needed the family to read along." "What about the cash?" I asked. "The $40,000 from the safe." Something almost like a smile crossed Delphine's face. "That one, I think, is going to be the easiest thread of all, because I don't believe that money was ever in that safe to begin with." What we found about the cash made more sense once we understood why Vivian had needed money badly enough to sell her dead aunt's jewelry within 10 days of the funeral. Preston Ashworth had spent 6 years building a small real estate fund, raising money from friends and family for coastal development projects that had performed reasonably well, until a permitting dispute stalled his largest project the previous winter and triggered a covenant in his construction loan. A title researcher Delphine had worked with for years found the filing within days. A default notice issued in February, giving Preston 60 days to cure the loan or lose the property. The amount required, $290,000. Joe had died in March, 2 weeks into that 60-day window. Vivian hadn't taken the brooch and the prints out of simple greed, though greed was certainly part of it. She'd taken them because her husband was 6 weeks from losing nearly everything they'd built, and the $75,000 advance Joe had given them that same year hadn't been enough to close the gap. I thought of Joe's own line in the ledger. "I no longer believe I'll see this repaid, but I am recording it anyway because someone should." She'd known, even then, that it wouldn't be the end of it. "She accused me first," I said, understanding the mechanics of it fully for the first time, so nobody would think to ask what she was doing in the 10 days before the funeral. "That's the pattern," Delphine said. "The accusation isn't really about you. It's a smoke screen, built loud and fast enough that nobody has time to look at the actual math before the story sets." "I want the cash traced all the way down," I said. "I want to know exactly where that $40,000 was the day Joe died." Delphine was already reaching for her legal pad. "Then let's go talk to her bank." Before we got that far, Vivian staged the confrontation I think she'd been building toward since the day of the funeral. It happened at my mother's house, on a Sunday in early August, under the pretense of a family dinner that Vivian had organized herself, inviting our cousins, 2 aunts on our father's side, and notably Preston, who sat at the far end of the table looking like a man who very badly wanted to be somewhere else. I almost didn't go. Delphine had advised against it, gently but firmly, worried about exactly the kind of public spectacle Vivian was clearly hoping to create. I went anyway, because I understood, by then, something about my sister that Delphine hadn't quite had the chance to learn yet, that letting her build the confrontation on her own terms, in front of an audience, was exactly the kind of rope she needed to hang herself with. She waited until the main course had been cleared, until every relative at that table had a full glass of wine and nowhere else to be, before she stood up. "I think it's time this family faced something uncomfortable," she said, and I watched her scan the table the way a performer checks a room before a difficult scene. "My sister has been sitting on stolen property from our aunt's estate for months now, refusing to return it, refusing to even discuss it honestly, while I've had to carry the burden of settling Aunt Jo's affairs completely alone." Nobody said anything. I felt every eye at that table slowly turn toward me. "I think," Vivian continued, her voice starting to catch, theatrically, exactly the way it had at the funeral reception, "that this family needs to consider whether Margaret should even be welcome at gatherings like this one, until she's willing to be honest about what she took." My mother's hand tightened around her wine glass. My cousin Denise looked down at her plate. Preston studied the tablecloth like it held the answer to a question he badly wanted to avoid. I stayed quiet for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of pressure in that room, and I watched my sister's confidence start to waver slightly at the edges, the way it always does when someone doesn't fill a silence the way you've counted on them filling it. "I understand why you'd want to have this conversation in front of everyone," I said finally, my voice level, deliberately calm. "It's easier to make an accusation stick when there's an audience watching for a reaction. But I'm not going to give you one tonight, Vivian. I'm going to tell you, in front of everyone at this table, that I have proof, real, documented proof, of exactly what happened to everything that went missing from Aunt Jo's house. And when I'm ready to share it, I will. Not because you've demanded it in front of our family, because it's time." "That's not an answer," Vivian said, but something in her voice had shifted, some of the theatrical certainty starting to crack at the edges. "It's the only answer you're getting tonight," I said. "You wanted this family to watch me defend myself. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm done explaining myself to people who decided the ending of this story before they ever asked me a single honest question." I stood up, thanked my mother for the dinner, and left before dessert. My hands were shaking by the time I got to my car, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of staying steady in a room built to knock me off balance. My mother called 2 days later. "Did you take anything from Jo's house?" she asked, her voice smaller than I was used to hearing it. "No," I said, "not one thing that wasn't left to me. I think you already know that." "I was scared," she admitted, her voice cracking in a way I'd never once heard in 59 years. "Scared that if I sided with you publicly, I'd lose her. Your love has never come with conditions, Margaret. I think I've been taking that for granted my whole life." "I have proof, Mom," I said. "Real proof. I'm going to share it soon in the right room, and when I do, I need you ready to actually see it." "I'll be ready," she said. "I should have been months ago." The last piece fell into place 2 weeks before the scheduled mediation, and it came from the simplest source of all, Jo's own bank. Delphine had subpoenaed records related to the safe as part of formal discovery. Jo had rented a safety deposit box at First Coastal Bank the previous November, 4 months before she died, visiting it twice on record to deposit a total of $52,000, time-stamped, witnessed by a bank employee both times. She moved it out of the house months before she died, Delphine said. "The $40,000 your sister claims vanished from that safe during the hour you waited with Corinne. It was never in the house to begin with. It's been sitting in a bank vault this whole time, untouched, exactly where Jo put it." "Why would she risk a claim that specific?" I asked. "It's the easiest piece of her whole story to disprove." "Because it was never built to survive scrutiny," Delphine said. "It only had to survive one afternoon, the funeral, when everyone's grieving and nobody's thinking to ask for bank statements. She never expected anyone to still be checking her math months later. We sent formal notice to Bradley Hutchins that week, laying out what discovery had produced. The safety deposit records, Selwyn Marsh's documentation with Vivian's own license copy, the Charleston consignment file, Corinne's sworn statement, Walter's confirmation of $685,000 in witnessed advancements. We held the ledger and the notebook itself in reserve, not hidden, just saved for a room where their full weight could land at once. Hutchins called 3 days later, wanting to talk settlement, a quiet dismissal, both sides signing a non-disparagement agreement, no formal record either of us would have to live with. It also means none of this ever gets said out loud. I told Delphine, in a room where my mother and my cousins actually have to hear it. That's the trade. No, I said, I don't want quiet, I want the room. We spent the 2 weeks before mediation methodically, checking every fact twice. Delphine warned me Vivian would cry exactly the way she had at the funeral reception, that the whole room would be watching to see if I cracked under it. I confirmed, one last time, that every piece of documentation was exactly where it needed to be. Selwyn, Odell, Walter, Corinne, all of it. The night before, I finally opened the second envelope from the desk, the unaddressed one, its flap never quite sealed. Inside was a single page, dated less than a month before Joe died, in handwriting less steady than the rest of the ledger. If it's come to this, then I was right to be afraid, and I'm sorry you had to carry the weight of proving it. I never once doubted which of my girls actually loved me. I only ever doubted which one would tell the truth about it afterward. Go finish this the way I taught you to finish everything, carefully, and without raising your voice. I read it 3 times before I let myself cry, alone in my kitchen, the night before I needed to be steadier than I'd ever been in my life. The mediation was held in a small conference room 2 blocks from the Calder cabinet, in a suite of offices Walter Fenwick's firm used for exactly this kind of proceeding. A long table, good light through tall windows, water glasses set out at every place like this, was any other business meeting instead of the moment I'd spent an entire summer preparing for. Vivian arrived with Bradley Hutchins and Preston, all 3 of them dressed like they were attending something considerably more formal than a mediation. Vivian in black, which I noticed, and which I think was a deliberate choice, the same instinct that had made her wear the exact right dress to that first funeral reception. My mother came too, at my invitation, sitting near the head of the table beside Walter, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and I understood, watching her, that she'd meant what she'd told me on the phone weeks earlier. She was there to actually see it this time, not to hide behind careful arithmetic with her own hands. Delphine sat beside me, a single slim folder in front of her, not the whole case, just what she needed close at hand, the rest of it organized and ready in her bag beneath the table. Walter opened the proceeding the way he opened everything, with careful, unhurried procedure, laying out the ground rules, the purpose of the session, the hope, stated formally but genuinely meant, that a resolution could be reached without further escalation. Then he turned it over to Bradley Hutchins, who spent nearly 20 minutes laying out Vivian's complaint in full, the missing brooch, the prints, the cash from the safe, the position of trust I had allegedly abused, all of it delivered with the practiced, confident cadence of a lawyer who genuinely believed, or at least believed convincingly enough, that the facts were on his side. Then it was Vivian's turn to speak, and she did exactly what Delphine had warned me she would do. Her voice cracked almost immediately. She talked about growing up in my shadow, about always being the sister who tried harder and got noticed less, about how devastating it had been to lose Aunt Jo, and then discover, within days, that pieces of her inheritance had simply vanished. She talked about trust and betrayal and how hard it had been to bring this complaint against her own sister, how she'd agonized over it for weeks before finally deciding that the family's need for the truth outweighed her own discomfort at having to do something this painful. I never wanted it to come to this, she said, tears genuinely running down her face by then, and I want to be honest with you, even knowing everything I knew. Sitting there watching her, some old, worn-down part of me still felt the pull of it, the particular gravity my sister has always had over rooms full of people who love her. I let her finish completely. I didn't interrupt once. Then, when the room had gone quiet, when Walter looked at me and asked, gently, whether I had anything I wanted to say in response, I finally spoke. I didn't steal the money, I said. I just found where it actually went. I watched that sentence land across the table, watched Bradley Hutchins's expression shift first, the particular stillness of a lawyer realizing, before his own client does, that the ground underneath this meeting has just changed shape. I opened Delphine's folder and started, methodically, the way Joe had taught me to handle any piece of evidence, carefully, in order, giving each item the weight it deserved before moving to the next. I laid out Selwyn Marsh's documentation first, the private jewelry sale, 10 days after Joe's death, Vivian's own driver's license photocopied as part of his standard practice. I watched my sister's face while Walter read the date out loud. I watched Preston go very still beside her. I laid out the Charleston auction house's consignment file next, the Audubon prints, Joe's private inventory stamp still visible in the corner photograph, consigned under Rebecca Sorrell's name, a woman with no history in the trade, and an address in Bluffton, South Carolina, who happened to be Preston's cousin. That's not, Vivian started, but her voice had lost the smooth, practiced quality it had carried for the last 20 minutes. I'm not finished, I said, gently but firmly enough that she stopped. I laid out the safety deposit box records, the $40,000 Vivian had described so specifically at the funeral reception, moved into a bank vault 4 months before Joe died, untouched, still sitting exactly where our aunt had put it, every dollar accounted for and waiting to be distributed properly through probate. You told 40 people at that reception that you saw that cash in the safe 2 years ago, I said. Joe moved it to the bank in November. It was never in that house the morning she died. You built an entire accusation around money that had already been safely stored for months because you needed a story fast and you didn't think anyone would ever check. Vivian didn't answer that. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely unsure of what to say next. There's more, I said, and I looked at Walter, at my mother, at Bradley Hutchins, before I finally looked back at my sister. I found something else, Vivian. In the desk Aunt Joe left me. Something I think you need to see because I don't think you fully understood until this exact moment how carefully she'd been watching. I reached into my bag and set the ledger on the table between us. I opened the ledger to the first advance entry and slid it across the table toward Bradley Hutchins, who read it silently, his expression shifting from confusion to something considerably more careful within a matter of seconds. This is a personal ledger, kept in a private cost code your client's aunt used for over 50 years in her business, Delphine said, taking over now, her voice calm, precise, entirely without triumph, which I think made it land even harder in that room. We've had it independently reviewed. It documents 22 years of advances made by Josephine Calder to Vivian Ashworth, tuition payments, a home down payment, wedding expenses, and 2 separate business bailouts related to her husband's development company. The total, verified against dated entries and cross-referenced with Walter Fenwick's own witnessed signatures on 3 of the underlying transfer documents, comes to $685,000. I watched my mother's hand come up to cover her mouth. Walter, Delphine continued, can you confirm your involvement in witnessing those transfers? I can, Walter said, quietly. I witnessed 3 of the documents personally, at Josephine's request. She was always very clear that these were advancements against Vivian's eventual inheritance, not gifts, and she wanted them properly documented even though she chose not to itemize them formally in the will itself. Which means, Delphine said, turning back to Vivian and Bradley, that your client received nearly $700,000 from her aunt over the past 22 years, more than double what she's currently accusing my client of stealing, while telling this entire family, repeatedly, publicly, for over a decade, that she'd never received $1 of help. Vivian sat very still, her tears gone now, replaced by something harder, more careful, the particular stillness of someone doing rapid math they weren't prepared to do out loud. I reached back into my bag and set the smaller notebook on the table, open to the entry I'd chosen weeks earlier, the one I'd known, since the night I first found it, would be the one that mattered most in this exact moment. This one isn't written in numbers, I said. It's written in a private shorthand Joe used just for family, going back to a joke our grandmother made decades ago. She called me the magpie. She called you the peacock, Vivian, and I don't think she meant it as a compliment. And I think, somewhere underneath everything, you already know that. I read the final entry out loud, my voice steady, the way I'd practiced it the night before, alone in my kitchen. The peacock will come back for more, and she will bring lawyers with her this time, dressed up as grief. Make sure the magpie has proof before she needs it, because I won't be here to hand it to her in time. The silence in that room, after I finished reading, was the longest I have ever sat inside in my entire life. Vivian didn't speak right away. I watched her look at the ledger, and then at the notebook, and then, briefly, at Preston, whose face had gone the particular gray color of a man watching his own version of events collapse in real time in front of people whose opinion he'd apparently cared about maintaining. She wrote that about me, Vivian said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, before any of this even happened. 6 weeks before she died, I said. She predicted almost exactly what you'd do, Vivian, not because she was psychic, because she'd watched you for 22 years, quietly, carefully, the same way she taught me to watch a piece of paper before I ever trusted what it claimed to be. Bradley Hutchins had gone very quiet beside his client, and I watched him lean over and say something to her in a low voice, the particular urgent murmur of a lawyer trying to regain control of a room that had already, decisively, slipped away from him. I want to be very clear about something, Delphine said, before either of them could speak again. We are not here today to discuss whether my client should be prosecuted for anything. She didn't take a single item from that house. What we have established, conclusively, with independent documentation from a licensed jeweler, an auction house, a bank, and your own client's aunt's private records, is that Vivian Ashworth sold 2 pieces of estate property within 10 days of her aunt's death, invented a story about missing cash that had already been safely relocated months earlier, and then publicly accused her sister of the very theft she herself had committed, while having already received, over the preceding 2 decades, an amount of money nearly 3 times greater than what she falsely claimed was missing. Walter cleared his throat, the sound of a man about to say something he clearly found no pleasure in saying. I have to note, for the record, he said, that under the advancement doctrine, and given the documentation just presented, Vivian's remaining share of the estate can be reduced to account for these prior distributions, exactly as her aunt intended when she recorded them so carefully. Additionally, given the unauthorized sale of estate property that had not yet cleared probate, restitution to the estate is very likely warranted, separate from any adjustment to her inheritance. How much, Vivian said, and her voice had gone flat now, stripped of every ounce of performance it had carried 20 minutes earlier. Given the combined value of the brooch, the prints, and the advancement total already documented, Delphine said, I'd estimate your remaining inheritance is reduced to essentially nothing, once restitution for the improperly sold items is factored in. You may, in fact, owe the estate money, depending on how the final accounting resolves. I watched my sister absorb that number in real time, watched something in her posture finally, completely, give way. She didn't yell. She didn't cry the way she'd cried 20 minutes earlier, performing grief for a room she'd expected to control completely. She just sat there, very still, staring at a ledger written in a code she'd never once bothered to learn, in a house she'd never once cared enough to sit quietly inside of the way I had, for 39 years, learning exactly the kind of patience that was about to cost her everything. I want to tell you honestly that I expected rage. I'd braced for it, the entire drive to that meeting, certain that whatever came after the reveal would be loud, dramatic, another performance built for whatever was left of the room's attention. It wasn't. My sister sat in that conference room for nearly a full minute without saying anything at all, and the silence itself became its own kind of answer, more damning than any argument she could have made. I'd like a moment with my client, Bradley Hutchins said finally, and Walter nodded, and the 3 of them, Vivian, Preston, and their lawyer, stepped out into the hallway while the rest of us sat in a room that suddenly felt too quiet, too large, for the 6 people left inside it. My mother reached across the table and took my hand, The first time she'd touched me since this whole thing had started, and I felt something in my chest finally, quietly, come undone. "I should have believed you months ago," she said. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I let her tell me a story because the story was easier than admitting what I already half suspected about my own daughter." "You're here now," I said. "That matters more than you think it does." Walter busied himself with his own papers during those 20 minutes, though I noticed he wasn't actually reading anything, just squaring the same stack of documents over and over. The small, contained fidget of a man who'd known my aunt for 40 years and was clearly working through some private grief of his own about exactly how right she'd turned out to be. At one point, he looked up at me and said, quietly, almost to himself, "She told me once that patience was the only inheritance worth leaving anybody." I didn't fully understand what she meant until just now. We sat like that for nearly 20 minutes before the door opened again, and when Vivian came back into the room, something about her had changed. Not softened, exactly, but hollowed out, like a person who had spent her whole adult life building a particular version of herself and had just watched, in real time, every load-bearing wall of it come down at once. "I need everyone to understand," she said, her voice quiet now, none of the performance left in it, that I never meant for it to go this far. I panicked. Preston's fund was going to fail. We were going to lose everything we'd built, and I told myself Aunt Jo would have understood, that she'd have wanted us to have those items anyway, eventually, so it wasn't really. She stopped herself, hearing, I think, exactly how thin that justification sounded, said out loud. In a room full of people who now had every piece of proof, they needed to know better. "You didn't just take the items, Vivian," I said, and I kept my voice level, not cruel, just steady, the way I'd promised myself I would stay no matter what happened once we got to this room. "You built an entire public story about me being a thief to protect yourself, and you let this whole family believe it for 5 months. Mom believed it. Our cousins believed it. Half of Savannah believed it, because you made sure of it at that reception, before anyone had a chance to ask a single real question." "I know," Vivian said, and for the first time in this entire story, I believed her. "I don't need you to apologize to me right now," I said. "I need you to understand that this isn't a family disagreement anymore. This is a legal matter now, with real consequences, and it's going to unfold exactly the way it's going to unfold, whether either of us likes the shape of it or not." The formal resolution took another 6 weeks to finalize, most of it handled through Delphine's office and Walter's, with far less drama than the mediation itself, because there was, by that point, nothing left to argue about. Vivian's remaining share of the estate, what would have been roughly $1 million in stock and additional assets, on top of the house, was reduced to zero once the advancement total and the value of the improperly sold items were fully accounted for. She was ordered to return the proceeds from the private jewelry sale and the auction consignment, both of which Selwyn Marsh and the Charleston auction house cooperated fully in unwinding, given the clear provenance dispute. The brooch itself, purchased by a private collector before the dispute became public, required an additional negotiation, ultimately resolved with a cash settlement covering its full appraised value, paid back into the estate. Because the house on Habersham Street had already been transferred into Vivian and Preston's names before any of this came to light, and because Preston's development fund collapsed entirely that same autumn, the permitting dispute never resolving in his favor, the property ultimately lost to foreclosure regardless of the money Vivian had scrambled to raise. They were forced to sell the house within the year simply to cover what they now owed, both to the estate and to a growing list of other creditors. I didn't take satisfaction in that the way I might have expected to, months earlier, sitting in that parlor holding a cold cup of coffee. What I felt instead, watching the pieces settle, was something quieter, the particular, unglamorous relief of watching a system finally, correctly, do exactly what it was supposed to do, without me having to raise my voice a single time to make it happen. Preston moved out that winter, and the last I heard, through cousins who still occasionally passed along news I hadn't asked for, he and Vivian were living separately. The marriage strained past whatever it had been able to survive once the money and the story both came apart in the same season. Walter closed the estate formally that December, in a brief, almost anticlimactic hearing that bore no resemblance to the mediation months earlier. No tears, no audience, just a probate judge reviewing a stack of finalized paperwork and signing off on distributions that finally matched, dollar for dollar. Everything Joe had actually intended 22 years of careful entries to protect. The safety deposit box cash came to me and my mother, split according to the will's original terms. The sideboard, tracked down through the same consignment house Vivian had used, was recovered and returned to the estate intact, eventually finding its way into my own dining room, where it sits today. I framed the closing order itself, briefly, before deciding that was a step too far even for me, and put it instead in the same archival box where the ledger now lives. I sent Selwyn Marsh a note that winter, thanking him again for the call that had started the whole unraveling. He wrote back a short reply I still have. "Any dealer can price a piece," he wrote. "It takes a particular kind of person to price the truth accurately too, even when it costs them a difficult phone call. I'm glad I made it. I didn't pursue anything beyond what the estate required. I could have. Delphine told me more than once. There was a real argument for a separate civil claim over the defamation, the months of public accusation, the damage to my own professional reputation in a small enough town that some of my clients had clearly heard whispers before the truth ever caught up to them. I don't want more of this, I told her, the week the estate settlement finalized. I want it to be over. I got what I actually needed, the truth, said out loud, in a room full of people who finally had to hear it whether they wanted to or not. That's enough. Delphine studied me for a long moment, the particular look she'd give me sometimes across her kitchen table, like she was checking whether I really meant something or just needed to hear myself say it. That's enough, she agreed finally. It usually is, once people actually see the proof clearly. You didn't need to punish her, Maggie. You just needed everyone to stop believing a story that was never true. Preston called me himself, about 3 weeks after the settlement finalized, which surprised me enough that I almost let it go to voicemail. "I don't expect you to want to talk to me," he said, once I'd picked up. "I just needed to say some of this out loud to somebody, and you're the only person left in this whole mess who I think might actually listen without already knowing exactly what they want to hear back." I didn't say anything right away, so he kept going, the words coming out in the particular rush of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this conversation more than once in his own head before working up the nerve to have it. "I knew about the brooch," he said. "Not the day of, not right away, but within the week. I told myself it wasn't really stealing, because it was going to be Vivian's inheritance eventually anyway. We were just accessing it early, is how I let myself think about it. I want you to know I understood, even then, how thin that reasoning was. I let myself believe it anyway, because the alternative was watching everything we'd built collapse in front of our kids, and I didn't know how to sit with that. Did you know she was going to accuse me?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that I understood the answer before he gave it. "Not the specifics," he said. "Not that first afternoon, not exactly how she'd do it. But I knew she needed a story, fast, that explained where things had gone, and I knew you were the person she'd always resented most, the whole time I've known her." I didn't stop her. I told myself that not helping build the story was different from actually stopping it. I understand now that it wasn't really different at all. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "The case is over, Preston. None of this changes what already happened. I keep thinking about the day you called Vivian, back in June, and asked her privately about the brooch and the prince, before any of this went to lawyers," he said. "She told me about that call that same night, laughing about it, actually, said you were grasping at nothing. I remember sitting there listening to her laugh about it and feeling something turn over in my stomach because I knew you weren't grasping at anything. I knew exactly what you were asking about. I didn't say a word. I let her keep laughing. Because I think I owe somebody the truth," he said, "and my wife hasn't been able to give it to you, not really, not without turning it into something about her own pain instead. I lost the development project. I'm losing the marriage, probably, if I'm honest about where things stand right now. I don't have much left to protect anymore by staying quiet. And I keep thinking about my own kids, someday, asking me what actually happened this year, and I don't want the answer to be a story I built to protect myself instead of the truth." I sat with that for a long moment, turning the phone over in my hand, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel toward a man I'd mostly thought of, for months, as a background figure in someone else's betrayal. "I appreciate you telling me," I said finally. "I don't know what to do with it beyond that. I'm not going to pretend it fixes anything." "I'm not asking it to," Preston said. "I just didn't want to be one more person in this family who let a convenient silence stand in for the truth." We didn't talk again after that call, not really. Beyond a polite word or two at the one family gathering we both happened to attend that winter. But I've thought about that conversation more than once since, because I think it taught me something about the shape of my sister's story that I hadn't fully understood until then, that it hadn't just been her building it alone, in a vacuum. It had been built, piece by piece, out of every person around her, who found it easier to stay quiet than to ask a single uncomfortable question. At the moment, it might have actually mattered. Word travels in a town like Savannah the way it travels everywhere, eventually, no matter how carefully someone tries to control it, slowly at first, in careful, half-whispered versions, and then all at once enough people who actually know the full story stop bothering to stay quiet about it. I didn't tell anyone myself, beyond the family directly involved. I didn't need to. Selwyn Marsh mentioned it eventually to a few trusted colleagues in the trade, the way professionals talk shop when something this unusual happens in a small, tightly connected industry. Walter Fenwick's firm handled the estate's public probate filings exactly as required by law, which meant anyone curious enough to look could find the basic facts on record at the courthouse. And Vivian's own circle, the country club, the parents from the private school, the wide, gossiping network of people who'd once believed her story completely, eventually started asking their own questions. Once the house went up for sale barely a year after she'd moved into it with such fanfare. I ran into Adele Sanborn, an old family friend of ours, in the grocery store that following spring, and I watched her face do the thing I imagine my own face must have done 100 times over that long, difficult summer. The particular shift of someone recalculating an entire narrative they'd accepted without asking enough questions. "I heard some things," she said carefully. "I wanted you to know I never fully believed it, Margaret. Not really." I didn't correct her, though I noted, quietly, that not really and not at all are two very different sentences. And I've learned enough by now to recognize which one people usually mean when they're trying to repair a friendship after the fact. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, and I meant it, even knowing what I knew. Business at the Calder cabinet actually grew that year, which surprised me at first, and then, thinking about it more, didn't surprise me at all. People in this business respect provenance above almost everything else, the careful, documented history of a piece, proof of exactly where it came from and who it passed through along the way. I think, without either of us ever saying it directly, my clients understood that a woman who'd spent an entire summer patiently building an airtight case, instead of a loud public argument, was exactly the kind of person you wanted handling something as delicate as your family's most valuable papers. I hired Corinne back that fall, not as household staff this time, but as the shop's part-time archivist, cataloging incoming estate collections with the same careful attention she'd once given to Joe's own home. She cried a little the day I offered her the position, standing in the same workshop where I'd found the false-bottomed desk. "Miss Joe would be glad," she said. "She always said you were the only one of the two of you who ever really understood what this place was actually worth." I won't pretend the summer cost me nothing professionally, before any of this turned around. Two long-standing clients quietly moved their business elsewhere that July and August, both citing, in careful, indirect language, a preference for keeping things simple during what one letter called an unsettled time for the shop. I never learned exactly what either of them had heard, or from whom, but I understood, reading those letters at my own kitchen table, that Vivian's story had reached further into my working life than I'd let myself imagine while I was busy building a case, instead of defending my reputation out loud. Both clients came back within the year, once the truth was a matter of public record rather than a rumor at a book club. I didn't gloat about it. I simply took the calls, professionally, the way I always had, and let the work speak for itself the same way it always had. I heard about the Camellia Ball secondhand, the way I heard about most of what happened to my sister that year, from people who couldn't quite keep the details to themselves even when they were trying to be kind about delivering them. The Camellia Ball was the kind of Savannah institution Vivian had spent 2 decades working her way into. A spring benefit for the Historical Society, black tie, the guest list curated as carefully as any exhibition catalog, an invitation Vivian had chaired the planning committee for the previous 3 years running. She wasn't asked back onto the committee that spring. She wasn't asked back at all, according to my cousin Denise, who still received the invitation herself and reported, without much relish, that Vivian's name had simply stopped appearing on any list connected to the event, quietly, without anyone ever having to say why out loud. She went anyway, that year, as a general ticket holder rather than a chair, and Denise told me she'd stood near the bar for the better part of an hour before anyone came over to speak with her, and that the people who eventually did seemed to do it out of a kind of performed obligation rather than warmth. A quick hello, a comment about the flowers, nothing that invited her to stay in the conversation any longer than politeness strictly required. I didn't take satisfaction in hearing that, not the way I might have expected to a year earlier, standing in that parlor with a cold cup of coffee in my hand. What I felt instead was something closer to recognition, the particular, unglamorous consequence of having spent a lifetime building a reputation on performance rather than substance, and then watching the performance stop working the exact moment the audience finally had the facts. She still thinks people just haven't heard her side yet, Denise told me, the day she relayed all of this. I don't think she understands that they have. That's the part I don't think she's caught up to. Preston's mother, a formidable woman named Charlotte Ashworth who'd never much cared for me and never bothered hiding it, apparently told a mutual friend that some families just can't help tearing each other apart over money. A line clearly meant to spread the blame evenly across both sisters, rather than settle it where the evidence actually pointed. I heard about that comment too, secondhand, the way I heard almost everything that year, and I let it go the way I'd let go of most of it, not because it didn't sting, but because I'd learned, over one very long summer, that correcting every unfair sentence said about you in a town this size is its own kind of full-time job, and I had a shop to run. There's one more person I want to tell you about, because I think she taught me something I leaned on constantly that year without ever fully naming it until much later. Her name was Grace Delacroix, and she'd been the first serious client I ever had. Back when I was 29 years old and just beginning to take on appraisal work outside the cabinet, a museum registrar, exacting and unsentimental, who'd trusted me with a fragile collection of Reconstruction-era letters, when I had almost no track record to justify that trust. She had a rule she repeated to me often enough over the years that I'd absorbed it the way you absorb a favorite piece of advice, without ever meaning to memorize it word for word. Provenance isn't about what someone claims. It's about what survives being checked. I called her, of all people, during the worst week of that whole ordeal, the week after the funeral reception, sitting in my car outside the shop with the engine off because my hands weren't quite steady enough yet to drive. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did start to finish. The accusation, the moving truck on Joe's lawn, all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Margaret," she said finally, using my full name the way she always did when she wanted me to actually hear something, "I want you to understand what's happening to you right now. Your sister is trying to write your character for the rest of this family before you ever get the chance to write it yourself. Thief, ungrateful, unstable, whatever version serves her in a given room. The only real defense against that is exactly what I taught you to do with a stack of letters you'd never seen before. Check everything. Trust nothing you haven't verified yourself. And do not, under any circumstances, let someone else's panic convince you that you're the one who did something wrong." I thought about that advice more times than I could count over the months that followed, sitting on the workshop floor with the desk's false bottom open in front of me, across Delphine's kitchen table working through a spreadsheet, in that conference room on Bull Street watching my sister's composure finally crack. Every time I felt the old, familiar pull to shrink myself down to a size that would make everyone else more comfortable, I heard Grace's voice instead, steady and unbothered, the voice of a woman who'd spent 40 years refusing to accept a claim simply because it was said with confidence. She did something else for me, too, that I didn't ask for and didn't find out about until months later. When whispers about the lawsuit started reaching a few professional circles that overlapped with mine, a museum curator in Atlanta, an insurance adjuster I'd worked with for years, Grace got ahead of it before I even knew there was anything to get ahead of, telling anyone who asked, plainly and without hedging, that she'd trust my judgment on a piece of paper over almost anyone else's in the state, lawsuit or no lawsuit. I called to thank her once I found out. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," she said. "That's usually why it's worth doing." My mother and I had dinner alone that October, just the two of us, at a small restaurant near Forsyth Park that Joe had loved for decades. The kind of place where the waiters had known our family long enough to simply nod when we walked in rather than needing a reservation confirmed. "I want to tell you something," my mother said, partway through the meal, setting down her fork like she needed both hands free for what she was about to say. "I've been thinking about this since the mediation, and I don't think I've said it clearly enough yet." "You don't have to say anything else, Mom. You already apologized." "I need to say this one anyway," she said. "I spent your whole childhood, and Vivian's, telling myself I loved you both exactly the same. And I think that was true, in the way I meant it. But I also think I let Vivian's version of things carry more weight than yours, for years, simply because she asked for that weight louder, and you never did. You never made me choose. So I let her keep choosing for both of us, and I called that keeping the peace, when really it was just me being too tired, or too afraid, to do the harder thing of actually looking closely at what was true." I sat with that for a long moment, watching my mother's face in the low restaurant light, understanding, for the first time, something about the shape of my own family that I don't think I'd ever let myself see quite this clearly before. "I'm not asking you to choose between us now," I said. "I don't think that's actually what any of this was about, underneath everything. I just needed you to eventually see what was actually true, instead of what was easiest to believe." "I see it now," my mother said. "I wish it hadn't taken a lawsuit and a locked drawer to get me there. I wish I'd simply trusted my own daughter, the quiet one, the one who never once needed to raise her voice to be believed." We didn't fully repair everything that evening. Over one dinner near a park Joe used to walk through every Sunday of her adult life. Some things don't repair in a single conversation, no matter how honest it is. But we started, that night, building something steadier than what we'd had before, a relationship based on what had actually happened, rather than whichever daughter had told the more convincing story that particular week. "Tell me about the desk," my mother said, near the end of the meal, and I understood she meant it as an offering, a way of asking to be let back into a part of my life she'd kept a careful, worried distance from for months. So I told her about the false bottom, and the ledger, and the notebook full of birds, and the letter Joe had written specifically for me, sealed and waiting in a drawer for exactly the moment I'd need it most. She always did see further ahead than the rest of us, my mother said, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon in the parlor, I watched her smile at the mention of her sister-in-law without any trace of the careful, guarded arithmetic she'd been doing with her hands for months. She told me something that night I hadn't known before, about the two of them as young women, before I existed, before Joe had ever opened a shop of her own. She used to tell me, back when we were barely 30, that the reason she never remarried after your uncle died wasn't grief. Not really. It was that she'd finally gotten a taste of what it felt like to owe nothing to anybody's opinion of her, and she wasn't in any hurry to give that back. My mother turned her water glass slowly on the tablecloth. I think about that a great deal now. I spent my whole marriage, and a good deal of the years after it, worrying about what everyone else thought I should do. Joe never did. I think that's part of why she trusted you the way she did, Margaret. You're the only one of us who never really needed anybody's permission either. I hadn't thought of myself that way before, not in those exact words, but sitting across from my mother in a restaurant Joe used to love, I understood there was something true in it, something I'd need the rest of that year, and probably longer, to fully grow into. I want to tell you what I did with the desk, because I think it matters, and because I don't want you to walk away from this story thinking the ending was only about a courtroom and a settlement. I finished restoring it myself, that following spring, the way Joe would have wanted it done, slow, careful, every joint checked twice before I touched it with a single tool. I used almost the entire $50,000 repair allowance she'd left me, not because the desk needed anywhere close to that much work, but because I understood, finally, exactly what she'd actually meant by attaching that number to it in the first place. She hadn't been budgeting for wood glue and wax. She'd been making sure I had the resources to take my time, to sit with that piece for as long as it took to find everything hidden inside it, without financial pressure rushing me past the one discovery that would end up mattering more than anything else in her entire estate. It sits in the front window of the Calder cabinet now, restored, gleaming, the false bottom still intact but empty, because I moved everything it once held into a proper archival box, climate-controlled, in the back office where I keep the shop's most important papers. I renamed the business that year, though only slightly. The Calder cabinet became Calder and Calder, a small acknowledgement, on the sign above the door, of exactly whose careful, patient work had actually built the place worth inheriting. I started a small archive, too, in a back room I'd once used for overflow storage, dedicated entirely to Joe's own papers and provenance records, open by appointment to researchers and historians studying the Savannah antiques trade across the decades she'd worked in it. Corinne runs it now, mostly, cataloging with the same devotion she once gave to keeping Joe's house in order. And I think, some days, watching her work, that it's the closest thing either of us has to still sitting at that kitchen table with Joe, learning something patiently, one careful lesson at a time. I see Vivian occasionally, at the kinds of events too small a town lets you avoid forever, a cousin's wedding, a funeral for an elderly family friend. We're polite. We're not close, and I don't think we ever will be again in the way sisters are supposed to be close. But there's no more performance in it either, no more careful audience building, just two people who know exactly what happened between them and have stopped pretending otherwise. My mother comes by the shop most Sundays now, sits in the chair by the window Joe always favored, and reads while I work in the back, and some afternoons, if the light's right, I look up and for just a moment, I can almost see both of them there at once. The aunt who taught me everything, and the mother who finally, eventually, believed me. I hosted a dinner that fall, almost exactly a year after the funeral reception where all of this started, in the same back room of the shop where I'd once sorted estate boxes for $4 an hour as a girl of 16. Delphine came, of course, and brought a bottle of wine she opened before we'd even finished setting the table, the same easy confidence she'd carried into every conference room that summer. Walter Fenwick came too, more relaxed out of his suit than I'd ever seen him, and spent a good 20 minutes telling Corinne a story about Joe negotiating a Georgian silver tea service, down to a price so low the seller apparently still brought it up at dinner parties 30 years later. Selwyn Marsh came, which surprised me a little. Appraisers and estate jewelers don't typically get invited back to the home of a family whose books they'd helped unravel. But Selwyn had become, somewhere in the process, someone I trusted the way you trust anyone who chooses honesty over convenience once it actually costs them something. Odell drove up from Charleston for it, still faintly delighted, I think, that his own careful eye for a watermark had ended up mattering as much as it did. My mother came early and stayed late, sitting near Corinne, the two of them trading stories about Joe I'd never heard before, small ordinary memories neither of them had thought worth mentioning, until there was finally a room warm enough to hold them. Tyler, Denise's oldest boy and the only one of my cousin's children who'd ever shown the slightest interest in the shop, came too, 17 years old and quietly fascinated by the roll-top desk sitting in the front window, asking Corinne question after question about the false bottom, until she finally walked him over and showed him, carefully, exactly how the seam had been cut. I watched him run his fingers along that same edge I'd found by accident, and I thought, not for the first time that year, about how a piece of furniture built 170 years earlier for an entirely different family had ended up mattering more to the shape of ours than almost anything else we owned. We didn't spend the whole evening talking about the case, though it came up, the way any shared storm comes up eventually among the people who weathered it together. Mostly we talked about ordinary things, Selwyn's granddaughter starting at the art college, Delphine's plan to finally take the sabbatical she'd been threatening to take for a decade, Corinne's plans for the new archive room. Near the end of the evening, once the plates had mostly cleared, Delphine raised her glass without any particular ceremony and said, simply, to the desk nobody wanted, Everyone laughed, the easy kind, the kind that only comes once enough time has passed that a memory can be held without flinching. I looked around that table at people who had chosen, at real cost to some of them, to tell me the truth instead of managing me the way parts of my own family once had, and I understood, sitting there, that I'd built something that year I hadn't set out to build at all. Not a case. Not a restored desk. A table full of people who actually meant what they said to my face. I raised my own glass back. To provenance, I said, and only Delphine and Selwyn fully understood what I meant by it. But everyone drank to it anyway, because by then we'd all learned enough about each other's stories to know that some toasts don't need a full explanation to be worth honoring. I drove out to Bonaventure the week after the shop reopened under its new name, alone, with a small bundle of the same white camellias Joe used to keep in a chipped blue vase on the counter of the cabinet. The one detail about her workspace I remembered more clearly than almost anything else from those long-ago summers. I hadn't visited often in the months since she died. I want to be honest about that, because I think grief sometimes works that way. The people who shape the most formative parts of us are sometimes the hardest graves to stand in front of, not because we miss them any less, but because standing there means finally sitting still with everything we haven't finished processing yet. I sat down on the grass beside her headstone, the way I used to sit on the workshop floor beside her desk, and I told her everything, out loud, quietly, the way you'd update an old friend who'd been away a long time. The parlor, the moving truck, the false bottom, and everything it turned out to hold. The mediation, the settlement, my mother's hand finding mine across a conference table for the first time in months. You knew, I said out loud, to a headstone that obviously couldn't answer back, though it felt, in that particular cemetery, quiet like it might. You knew, long before any of the rest of us did, exactly what she was capable of. You just made sure I'd have what I needed by the time it actually mattered. I thought about her line, framed now above my own desk. Learn it, and don't ever write it down anywhere somebody else might find it. I understood, sitting there, that it had never only been advice about a shop's cost code. It had been advice about patience itself, about waiting, watching, recording the truth quietly enough that no one thought to look for it until the exact moment it would do the most good. A groundskeeper passed by while I sat there, an older man pushing a small cart of tools, and he nodded at the camellias in my hand the way people do in this town when they recognize a ritual rather than an event. Miss Calder used to come out here herself, you know, he said, pausing a moment. Visited her own mother's plot every month, regular as anything, brought the same white flowers every single time. Never missed a month in the 11 years I've worked these grounds. I hadn't known that. It struck me, sitting there, that I was simply doing now what she had quietly done for decades before me, without ever once mentioning it to anyone, showing up, faithfully, for the people who'd earned it, long after there was any audience left to notice. Before I left, I set the camellias down against the base of the stone, the way she used to set fresh flowers by the register every Monday without fail, and I said the only thing that felt true enough to leave her with. Thank you for not leaving me the parts of this family that couldn't be trusted with the truth. I still have both letters, framed now, hanging in my own office above the desk where I do most of my work. Joe's first note, the one waiting for me the day I found the false bottom, and the second one, written less than a month before she died, the one that cost me the most to finally read. I didn't keep the ledger or the notebook out on display. Those live in the archive, properly preserved, available if anyone in this family ever needs to see them again, though I hope, honestly, that nobody ever does. What I kept close, instead, was something smaller, the exact sentence Joe wrote the day she taught me our shop's private code, decades before any of this happened, back when I was 20 years old sitting at her kitchen table with a receipt and a pencil. Every dealer worth their salt has one. Learn it, and don't ever write it down anywhere somebody else might find it. I understand that sentence differently now than I did the day she said it. She wasn't just teaching me how to protect a business from a customer trying to talk down a price. She was teaching me, all along, patiently, over decades, exactly how to protect the truth itself, quietly, carefully, in a language only the right person would ever be able to read, kept safe until the exact moment it was needed most. My sister stood up in a room full of 40 relatives holding paper plates and told them I'd swept my aunt's house clean before the lawyer ever arrived. She wanted an audience for that accusation because she understood, correctly, that a loud story told with confidence travels faster than a quiet one told with proof. She was right about that for a while. It took me an entire summer of patient, careful work to catch up to a lie that only needed one afternoon to spread. But I caught up to it. I sat with every piece of it, the way Joe taught me to sit with anything that mattered, until the proof was strong enough that no performance in any room could talk a single person out of believing it. Some evenings, closing up the shop, I still catch myself standing in front of that desk in the front window longer than I need to, running my hand along the same seam I found by accident on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I think about how close I came to never restoring it at all, how easy it would have been to leave it exactly the way Joe left it to me, half buried under drop cloths, the desk nobody wants, and let a false bottom nobody ever found stay closed forever. I think about my sister, too, standing in that parlor with 40 witnesses behind her, so certain that a confident story would always outrun a quiet one. It doesn't, in my experience. Not always. Sometimes the quiet one is simply waiting for the right person to finally sit down and look closely enough to find it. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever sat across a table from someone who decided, together with an audience, that you were worth less than the truth, I hope you'll subscribe to Revenge Lab and stay with us here, because that's exactly the moment every story we tell is really about. We believe the quiet ones are usually the ones actually telling the truth, and we think it's worth waiting for the world to finally catch up to that. I didn't sweep that house clean. I only ever kept the one thing in it that was honest. And in the end, that turned out to be the only thing that mattered at all.